Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the SAIS SNAM Practicum presentation. The Practicum team wants to thank our client SNAM, Professor Zaffos advised us for our project and allow us to conduct on-site assessments for the case studies. And we also want to thank EIE program providing the practicum opportunity. We're also very honored to have Professor Hengel at SAIS and Joanna, she is the Associate Director at Berkeley Research Group, as our guest speakers. So today we will present to you the future of natural gas in the transportation sector, explain our methodology, and we will look at 8 case studies in marine, trucking, and railway. And then we will conclude in our findings, and we'll have a panel discussion right after our presentation. So before we dive into, let me introduce our team. I'm Chih-Yang, and he's Nate, Ziyue, and Yuning. Okay, now I'll just give my colleague Nate.
So first, we're going to begin with the project overview. So SNAM, our client company, they're an Italian natural gas infrastructure company based in Italy. And they tasked us with examining the use of natural gas as a fuel in the transportation sector. And so we compiled a series of case studies, 8 case studies in total, looking at the use of natural gas in the marine sector, the trucking sector, and the railway sector. One of the reasons why we looked at natural gas as a transportation fuel is because it presents a cleaner alternative than some traditional fuels used in the shipping sector, such as heavy diesel fuels. It emits less CO2, less nitrous oxide, pretty much eliminates emissions of particulate matter. And this is particularly significant because the transportation sector globally accounts for roughly 30% of greenhouse gas CO2 emissions. And if there's any way that we can switch fuel sources in order to help reduce these emissions, natural gas presents a good opportunity to do this. But some of the drawbacks of natural gas, again, in the transportation sector, it's just beginning to pick up and really kind of gain steam. And so a lot of the infrastructure currently isn't built out. And also natural gas, which is methane, is a greenhouse gas itself. And it's 20 times more potent than CO2. And so this can be an issue if there are leakages in the infrastructure and the pipeline infrastructure and methane escapes into the atmosphere. So it's just something to be mindful of when working with natural gas. Our methodology for this research is we conducted a series, like I said, 8 case studies. We selected countries around the world, and we assessed just the risk level related to natural gas development. So the risk range from low risk all the way up to high risk. If there's a low risk, it means that the future development of the transportation sector in each specific case is positive and it's likely to continue. If it's high risk, that means there's large barriers to implementation of natural gas as a transportation fuel. And in evaluating each case, we looked at 2 different stakeholders, the infrastructure providers. An example of an infrastructure provider would be, say, a gas station that provides fueling stations for LNG and trucks. And an infrastructure user would be the company, the individual who owns that truck that is running on LNG and using LNG as a fuel. So we have the infrastructure providers and the users, and within each stakeholder, we looked at the economic risks, the regulatory risks, and also other miscellaneous risks that are relevant to the case. This diagram above, this chart above, shows all the different cases we did and the risks level for each case. We're going to go in detail case by case and explain how we arrived at each different risk level, but we wanted to give you just a quick overview of what we found in terms of risks related to natural gas development through our study. On to the case studies. We're going to begin with the marine sector. First, I just wanted to give you a quick explanation of some of the terms we're going to use so you can understand what we're talking about. One big term is LNG bunkering, and LNG bunkering is just more or less just a catch-all term. It's used to refer to the use of natural gas as a fuel in marine transport. And there's also 3 different ways to bunker a ship. It means to put LNG fuel into the ship. You can do it by truck, so a ship pulls into port. If you look at the diagram on the left, the ship pulls into port, and there's a truck that has a hose attached to it that fuels the natural gas from its tank onto the ship. There's ship-to-ship bunkering, which doesn't have to occur at the port. So a ship could pull up to another ship and transfer the liquefied natural gas onto that ship to run on as a fuel. And then finally, there's tank-to-ship, when again the ship pulls into the port, and there's a liquefied natural gas tank with a jetty attached to it that can adhere to the ship to fuel it with liquefied natural gas. In terms of policies that are impacting the global marine sector, the largest one is the International Maritime Organization, IMO's policy that's going to reduce the global cap on sulfur emissions. So the current cap is 3.5% of fuel content, and it's going to be reduced to 0.5%. So this means that traditional heavy diesel fuel oils that have been used in the marine sector will no longer be allowed unless a scrubber is attached to remove the sulfur from being emitted into the atmosphere, or that could happen. Another way that they can help to reduce the sulfur emissions is they could switch to low sulfur fuel oil, which is more expensive currently than liquefied natural gas, or they can install an LNG fueled engine on a current build or a new build ship, and LNG has a lower sulfur content and it'll agree with the IMO regulations. And one thing we're seeing a lot of the development of LNG in the marine sector is being driven by collaboration between business, government, just infrastructure providers, and infrastructure users. Our first case study is the Netherlands, and we assign the Netherlands an overall risk level of low, which is indicated by the green coloring. Brief background about the Netherlands. We looked at the Gate Terminal, which is the central hub for bunkering in the port of Rotterdam in the Netherlands. The port has been offering LNG bunkering since 2014. It was initially truck to ship, but in 2016, due to continued demand and market opportunities, they built a jetty, which allowed tank to ship and also ship to ship bunkering. But currently tank to ship and ship to ship bunkering. For the risk for infrastructure providers, from a regulatory perspective, the Port of Rotterdam has been very accommodating to the development of LNG bunkering. For example, the port built a dolphin channel, which allows safe ship-to-ship LNG bunkering, and it can happen outside of the port, which makes it more efficient for a ship to pull into the harbor, fuel up, and continue on its journey. Also, the government doesn't specifically set a tariff for the price of natural gas, and this allows the free market to decide what price to pay for the natural gas. So in the shipping sector, this is particularly beneficial for infrastructure providers because in some cases it can allow them to have maybe larger margins than if the government interfered and had a set tariff level. But there are still risks. There are still risks that are present. For example, although the Gate Terminal does offer the ship-to-ship bunkering, they can bunker 280 vessels a year, and in 2018 they only bunkered 25, so they're operating about 10% capacity, and so they built out this infrastructure and expectation of future market growth and development. But again, the market is still developing, so there's still a risk for infrastructure providers in that there's not a significantly high demand. One beneficial thing for the infrastructure providers is that in Northern Europe, on a regional basis, the bunkering infrastructure is developing, and places like Norway are really also leading the charge in building the infrastructure to enable regional transportation and transit for these marine vessels that are running on natural gas. For infrastructure users, again, the Port of Rotterdam has been very helpful. They provide discounts for LNG fueled vessels. For example, for ships that qualify as clean ships, they get a 10% environmental shipping discount on port dues. And also there's a 10% discount for LNG ships that choose to bunker in the port of Rotterdam. So this is making the economics of using liquefied natural gas more favorable for the infrastructure users. And also, like I mentioned, the Gate terminal has plenty of spare capacity to fuel more ships in a year. So there's plenty of supply available for vessels that want to run on LNG as a fuel. My next case is looking at Greece. And for Greece, assigned a medium risk level. The market is not as developed as it is in the Netherlands. Background on Greece, the central bunkering terminal in Greece is the Revithousa terminal. And this is part of the Poseidon Med 2 project, which is a project from the European Commission that seeks to establish marine bunkering regionally in the Eastern Mediterranean, like with Greece being the anchor point. So the government's really pushing that through. And also from the European Commission is the Blue Hubs program, which is providing financing for bunkering vessels to help encourage the development of bunkering in the Eastern Mediterranean. But one interesting thing about Greece is that they actually don't currently allow bunkering. They're in the process of developing it, and they're planning on building tank-to-ship bunkering starting in 2022. So the market is just being built out now. For infrastructure providers, the risk is low. Again, the EU is really supporting development of bunkering in the Eastern Mediterranean through the Blue Hubs program and also through the Poseidon Med 2 project. Additionally, the Prime Minister of Greece is supporting the development of natural gas. Specifically, they recently reached an agreement with Israel, Cyprus, and also Italy to build a natural gas pipeline to bring Israeli gas to the Eastern Mediterranean. So this should help to further reduce any supply risks for the infrastructure providers. But then again, as I mentioned, the market is currently being built out. But fortunately, there's strong regional cooperation and different countries throughout the Eastern Mediterranean all working together to build out this infrastructure, which lessens overall risk for any individual country or region. For infrastructure users, the risk, just in terms, again, the government supporting the development of this, of natural gas bunkering through various programs and financing initiatives. But it's still a nascent market, and if you want to run a ship on LNG currently in Greece, it's very difficult because the infrastructure isn't built out yet, so it's a high risk.
Okay, let's move on to the United States case. We assigned the risk would be the medium, and I will explain. So currently, in the United States, there are Port Fortune in Louisiana and the Jacksonville in Florida. They have bunkering facilities, and the reason why we chose Jacksonville because of its unique characteristics. The first one is the high utilization rates. They have more than 90% of utilization rates compared to Gate terminal, 20 to 30%, as my colleagues just mentioned earlier. And it's pretty high in the States and also over the world. And the second one is the location advantage. The main trade between the United States and Puerto Rico is through Jacksonville Port Authority. So, but here the location is an advantage for JAXPort, but it could be also a disadvantage for other terminals who want to operate this. So both infrastructure providers and the supplier and the terminals, they are regulated by different authorities, but they both in the same way about safety and environmental mitigations. So we don't think it would be a risk because FERC just signed the MOU with FAMSA. FAMSA is administration under DOT to reduce any interagency friction. And in terms of the economic risk, the supplier, they prefer on-site facility, usually the small-scale LNG, and because so that they don't need to pay the terminals that much rental fees. But So the future prices of LNG plays important role because currently they only sign short-term contract with the infrastructure users. So this one, the left one will be the ship-to-ship refueling. In the end, there's a green one is a LNG tanker, and the right one is the tank-to-ship. There's a pipeline connect to the tank. In terms of infrastructure users, I want to emphasize here would be the potential market for the United States, because JAX ports, they are around 20 in terms of the total trade of US ports, and all the top 20s, most of them, they have LNG terminals nearby, which means they have the capacity to operate bunkering facilities in the United States. And that's the brief summary about the marine sector in the United States. So I'll give my colleagues to talk about what's happening in China.
Thank you. So now let's go to the other side of the ocean and see what's happening in China's inland waterway sector. The overall risks of natural gas in inter-waterway sector in China is pretty high. And the development is mainly determined by the market and also the emission standards. The Chinese government hasn't successfully pushed forward the development of gas in this sector, despite various tentatives. And we can see from the fact sheet on the right, we can see that the implementation is far below the planification, and the market penetration rate is lower than 0.2%. So why these disappointing numbers? We can see that from the infrastructure provider side, the regulatory risks are pretty high. To start with, the process to get permits to build a new ships, LNG fuel ships, and also LNG refuel station is pretty complicated. We can see from this chart, this is just part of the process to get the permits to build a new LNG refuel station. And this involves more than 10 departments and 100 stamps. So it is pretty prohibitive, and it lasts more or less more than 2 years. Besides this, there are also very few regulation or standards for constructors to follow when they want to construct a new LNG refuel station, and that also constitute a major risk for them. Besides that, there are also very few incentives nor subsidies for infrastructure providers. In terms of economics, the upfront cost is pretty high, can range up to $15 million, but the demand is very low. In 2016, which is the most updated year, the refuel volume is only 1,100 tons. So that's pretty minimum. That leads to a very low IRR for the station holders, just less than 2%, meaning that in China, most LNG refuel stations are running a long-term loss. There are also other risks as well. For example, it is very difficult to pass the annual security test, which also due to the unnecessarily strict standards set by the government. For infrastructure users, the situation is not very promising as well. In regulatory side, it is risky, but not as risky as the infrastructure providers, because there are implementation of stricter emission standards and also the emission control areas. The government also promised to simplify the permitting process for acquisition and retrofitting of the LNG fuel ships. But still, it is very complicated. According to the ship owners, the process can last for 1 year to get the permission. For economic side, the upfront cost is also very high. It is 30% higher than diesel-fueled vessels, if similar model. And the subsidies for the LNG retrofitting and the LNG new ships also ended in recent years. So there are no subsidies now. But for diesel vessels, the subsidies still exist. So for the LNG fuel vessels to make an economic case, that will require a less than 6,000 yuan per ton LNG price in China, which is sometimes higher than this. And there are also other risks in the market. For example, there is no Chinese-made motors for retrofitting, and we have to import all the motors from abroad. And those motors can be too potent for the current Chinese inland waterway ships. So now let's move to another sector of transport where the LNG can has a potential more growing role to play. That is trucking. Now let's first look at the overall assessment. So there are two major players in this sector, CNG trucks and LNG trucks. In general, there is a mixed picture for these two trucks. The CNG trucks, they use compressed natural gas, which is compressed to less than 1% of the original volume. But its low energy density also requires a bigger and a very bulky tank in the front, so in the back. So that will severely limit its capacity. For LNG trucks, these disadvantages is eliminated because the energy density is higher, but the cost to produce LNG and also to produce the LNG trucks are higher than CNG trucks and also than the normal diesel fuel trucks. So that is also another disadvantage. Now let's first look at the United States, the trucking sector. So the overall risks we assigned is medium. The key driven factor is the market and also the emission standards. But the overall penetration rate in the United States is only 0.06%, which is pretty minimum. Compared with diesel trucks, the natural gas trucks have lower O&M costs and also lower fuel costs, but higher upfront costs and lower infrastructure availability. Compared with electric trucks, the LNG trucks the natural gas trucks have higher upfront costs, but lower fuel costs and also higher infrastructure availability for now. We don't know what will happen in the future because now the government is also pushing very hard to build charging stations. For infrastructure providers, in terms of regulation, there is no existing incentives or subsidies for natural gas refueling stations, but the DOT is required to set aspirational targets for alternative fuels, which include CNG and LNG, along key corridors. In terms of economics, the upfront cost to construct a new CNG or LNG refuel facility is high, ranging from $10,000 for a small unit in terms of CNG to around $1.8 million to build a new CNG refuel station. The cost for LNG is even higher, from $1 to $4 million. And this low availability of infrastructure leads to makes the CNG and LNG fleet to build their own infrastructure, which can be very, very costly. So for infrastructure users, in terms of regulations, there are some tax disadvantages against the alternative fuel, but some of them are already being addressed by policymakers. For example, the alternative fuel excise tax has been addressed, but the vehicle-based taxation disadvantages haven't been addressed by now. In terms of economics, we can see from the right chart, the fuel costs for LNG and CNG is slightly lower than the diesel cost. This is a clearer view. So for around 20 years, the CNG and LNG costs are lower than the gasoline and diesel price. But in the recent 5 years, we can see from 2014, these divergences have narrowed. So there are not as many advantages as before for CNG and LNG. The upfront cost is also higher to acquire a typical natural gas fuel trucks. It costs around $100,000 compared with $70,000 of diesel trucks. But the O&M costs are lower due to cleaner burning. But in general, the payback period of CNG trucks and LNG trucks are much longer than diesel trucks in the States. For diesel trucks, it's only 1 to 3 years, but for CNG trucks, around 10 years. For LNG trucks, more than 14 years, according to a research done by the Department of Energy. Regarding other risks involved, we can see that now there are few LNG and CNG trucks made available in the States. Last year, there is 0 LNG trucks made available in the States. Now let's move to Italy, where natural gas can play a more productive way.
Thank you, Ziyue. So let's now look at what's happening in Europe right now. Italy has been playing a critical role in developing natural gas trucks, and the overall risk is low to medium. So currently, Italy has 38% of the CNG refueling stations and 19% of the LNG refueling stations in the EU. And the key driving force behind it is environmental regulations regarding clean vehicle promotion. So if Italy wants to further develop clean vehicles, they have two options regarding infrastructure. One is about natural gas infrastructure, like natural gas terminals and natural gas stations. And the other option is EV charging stations. Due to the infrastructure availability, it's more practical to develop natural gas trucks in Italy because of 3 reasons. The first reason is that the Italian government already set ambitious goal regarding developing natural gas refueling stations before 2020. And there are still such goals regarding developing EV charging stations. And the second reason is that although building a natural gas, including LNG and CNG refueling station is very costly, each natural gas station can still get 200,000 euros of subsidy from the government. But there's no subsidy for building an EV charging station. And the third reason is that the existing natural gas infrastructure is a very good starting point. So the EU-funded LNG Blue Corridors project already built 10 natural gas stations in Italy. And there is still a lack of EV charging infrastructure in the country. And if we want to adopt a large amount of electric trucks in Italy, there will be a huge grid planning issues. However, if we think about this question from the perspective of infrastructure user side, actually they are pretty optimistic about the use of natural gas in the trucking sector. There are also 3 reasons. The first reason is that at the EU level, there will be a CO2 emission standard that set requirement for car manufacturers to ensure a certain percentage of their products are clean vehicles. And at the national level, the government has imposed lower fuel taxes on natural gas. And the second reason is that we can see from the table on the right. So a natural gas truck is cheaper than a diesel truck because they have lower fuel costs, lower fuel taxes, and lower purchasing costs and operating costs. Also, if you buy a natural gas truck, you can get some subsidies from the government. And the third reason is that although it's kind of complex to refuel a natural gas truck, and it may need some technical assistance from the gas station, it's still much faster to refuel a natural gas truck than a diesel truck. So overall, we can see that the markets for natural gas trucks in Italy is still very promising. But we still can't forget that the market penetration rate of natural gas trucks in Italy right now is only 0.4%, so there's still a long way to go. Now let's look at another case of trucking sector, which is China, where the overall risk level is medium. So currently, LNG trucking accounts for 12% of the total gas demand in China. And the similarity between the China's case and Italy's case is that they're both driven by the environmental regulations regarding clean vehicle promotion. But the difference is that the electric truck markets are more mature in China, so there will be more competition between among natural gas, diesel, and electric trucks. So we'll take Shenzhen, China as an example. So Shenzhen is a city that has the world's largest electric truck fleet, and also it has 76,000 LNG heavy-duty trucks. So developing natural gas trucks in Shenzhen, China is pretty risky for infrastructure providers. They have three concerns. The first concern is that the national level already have, well, both the national level and the local level already have some targets regarding building more EV charging stations, but there are no such targets regarding the natural gas infrastructure. And also, it takes a long time to get approved about building a new natural gas station because it needs 26 departments' approval. And the second concern is that we can see from the table on the bottom left. So LNG stations need over 6 years to cover all the costs, but EV charging stations only need less than 5 years. And the third concern is that although there are already national and local level technology standards regarding LNG stations, they still face a lot of gas supply shortage risks because there was a gas shortage problem in winter 2017 in China. So there's still a lot of threat and risks. And so for infrastructure users, actually the natural gas trucks are a very attractive option for them. So there are also three reasons. The first reason is that both the national and the local government are really determined to phase out the diesel trucks and also promote clean vehicles. And since natural gas trucks are pretty clean and has less carbon emissions than diesel trucks, so actually they can make use of this opportunity to have more development. And the second reason is that, we can see from the table, operating a natural gas truck costs less than diesel and electric trucks in the long term because they have lower gas prices and lower operating costs. And the third reason is that, compared to diesel trucks, a natural gas truck have longer service period and less leakage problem. And compared to electric trucks, they have longer range, so it can help mitigate the range anxiety problem of the drivers. So overall, developing natural gas trucks in Shenzhen, China is risky for infrastructure providers, but promising for those infrastructure users. And let's now turn to another sector, which is railway sector.
Okay, so last one, I know it's the last, so let's take a train. So a little bit about the railway sector. The railway can either use CNG or LNG. And so, but using LNG as the fuel for locomotives is not a new idea. BNSF and also Amtrak, they have developed and tested these techniques since 1980s. But they still have a lot of obstacles need to overcome in the United States. So we assign the risk is the highest among all our case studies. And we take Florida East Coast Railway as our example. So they are the Class 2 railway, which means they don't serve any passenger rails. And the reason why they want to enter into this market is because if you can see, before 2015, the prices difference between diesel and LNG is quite significant. So that's the reason why incentivize them. But so they are regulated by Federal Railway Administration, and the most top issue is the safety. So FRA considers if you want to transport LNG in your train, or either you want to use LNG as your fuel, is the safety concern that they really care about, and they think there should be another alternative for other vehicles. For economic risk, the prices difference between diesel and natural gas is really important, because for railway companies, they need to pay upfront costs to build the LNG facility, like infrastructure. And so if we look at this graph, you can either use CNG or LNG, but most of the companies, they prefer to use LNG. And the biggest obstacle for LNG is there might be no way for you to put the LNG storage facility in the rail yard, because that takes a lot of space. So they might need to find another space for them to place this facility. So, and also a reason why they tend to prefer to use LNG is because LNG can charge, you charge 90 minutes and you can run 1,400 miles. So it can apply to Class 1, which is the Amtrak or BNS, if they always want to think about, because they typically average, they just run 1,200 miles. So LNG will be the most biggest incentive for them to run the railway instead of using CNG. And that's all we have. Now we are moving to our conclusion.
Thanks, Chih-Yang. So here's the completed risk matrix again that I showed at the start of the presentation. And we just want to highlight a few trends that you might be able to notice. First of all, generally speaking, the marine sector has a lower risk than the trucking and railway sector. Risk in the trucking sector is generally mixed, and in the railway sector, for the case you did, it's a very high risk. And so that's just something to keep in mind, that the risk levels vary from sector to sector, and marine is currently getting a decent amount of momentum, especially in regions such as Europe. And also, another thing to note is that the risks differ between the infrastructure provider and also the infrastructure user, as you can see from the coloring. Generally, infrastructure users have lower risk just because the price of natural gas is cheap. Purchasing a natural gas vehicle isn't prohibitively expensive. But one of the biggest challenges lies with infrastructure providers, because the upfront investment cost to provide this infrastructure and also to have a regional infrastructure network is very expensive. And so that's something definitely to keep in mind as to why the risks are higher for infrastructure providers. And then finally, the risks, the drivers of LNG development differ from different regions in the world. In Europe, one of the biggest things that is driving LNG development in the transportation sector is regulations kind of pushing it forward and forcing it forward. In the United States, it's more market-driven, just based on the pure economics of it. And then finally, in China, LNG development is happening slowly, although the Chinese government is trying to encourage the development of LNG as a transportation fuel. There are currently things that are slowing the development of it due to issues with permitting and regulation. And so compared to places like Europe, the regulatory environment in China is slowing the development of LNG. Key conclusions for key findings for the marine sector. I just want to highlight the driving forces on the demand side. Touched on this a lot, but the changing sulfur emission standards are forcing the hand of a lot of these infrastructure providers and users to really make the switch to LNG as a fuel. There's also the governments are promoting cleaner vehicles to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, And finally, the price of natural gas, liquefied natural gas, is cheap, and it's going to continue, might continue to become more and more cost competitive with other fuels. And then on the supply side, there's various supports and financial initiatives, incentives to encourage the development of the sector. And we're seeing also regional coordination in places like Northern Europe and also the Eastern Mediterranean that are helping to encourage this marine sector development. Now on to the trucking sector.
So in terms of the key findings in trucking sector, no matter which stakeholder we're talking about, they are both facing two issues. One is policy, the other is money. So for infrastructure providers, the policy issue they are mainly facing is that there is still a lack of regulation and policy directly targeting natural gas infrastructure development. And also, the payback period of building a natural gas station is pretty long, and there's still a lot of uncertainties in the future demand. And for infrastructure users, they have relatively lower risk compared to the providers because it's still a relatively economically attractive option for those drivers compared to the diesel and electric trucks. And also, the government has tried really hard to promote clean vehicles around the world. So since natural gas trucks is cleaner than diesel trucks, so they can actually make use of the opportunity and get further development. So if we want to better develop natural gas trucks in the future, so there are two part of things we can do. The first one is that on the demand side, the government should definitely set carbon emission standards to make sure the clean vehicle promotion, and also offer more fuel tax discount for natural gas as a fuel. And on the supply side, there should be more incentives to build more natural gas infrastructure, such as natural gas stations, natural gas terminals, and also countries like China should definitely simplify the process of approving a natural gas station construction. So only by doing this, we can better bridge the supply and demand side of natural gas truck market.
Final stop. So in the United States, there's no policy incentive to promote the development by adopting natural gas as a fuel for the railway. And we consider the United States should implement the emission standards so that just let the railway participants choose either they want to develop electric or the natural gas, because in the United States, there's only 1% of railways electrification. So, and using LNG or electric trains is not mutually exclusive. For example, if you in Europe, there are a lot of electric trains, but LNG trains can also serve as different markets, like from village to village, more like a short-term route. So, and the second option would be the dual fuel operations, because the participants can either choose 90% of natural gas or 80% of natural gas, so that they don't need to purely rely on natural gas. And the demand for natural gas can also affect their operations in terms of building the storage facility. So that's all we have, and we made our clients, some lobbyist group, and Jacksonville, European Commission, that's all of us. We thank EIE providing this. And so now, thank you everyone, and we are kicking off our panel discussion. So allow me to introduce Professor Hengel and to the front, and Joanna, she is the Associate Director at Berkeley Research Group. So we'll have some discussions, and then we'll follow up with a Q&A. Thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna start. Okay, so let's start. I have a question for Joanna that about, because we know your expertise is in small-scale LNG facility, and that's also the infrastructure providers in United States, they are develop and they want to expand these markets in terms of the bunkering in United States. And I'm just wondering what's your insights and your thoughts?
The LNG bunkering in the United States,
Yeah.
in particular. I think unlike in Europe, where the LNG bunkering has been able to really succeed and develop thanks to a lot of EU funding and government regulation, you don't have the same incentive in the US as you pointed out in your presentation. That said, there is a lot of potential. You have access to a lot of cheap gas from the shale developments. You have great markets at hand, the Gulf Coast, the Caribbean. And you also have LNG export terminals that have been built. So you have an initial infrastructure there that can then be easily adapted to be able to provide LNG as bunkering. I think the business case isn't there yet because there isn't sufficient demand in terms of ships needing or looking for LNG. It hasn't yet developed. It has a little bit in terms of supply vessels for the offshore rigs in the Gulf Coast. Out of Port Fauchon with, I think Shell developed that. And now you have the Crowley ships and the Carnival the Carnival cruise ships that have decided to adopt LNG as a fuel and will be certainly one of the main clients from Shell and Jacksonville when they travel down to the Caribbean. So the market is beginning to turn, but there isn't sufficient demand for a lot of the infrastructure developers to actually make that plunge and take the risk to go down that road. Even those who looking at LNG export terminals that could easily, put an add-on and service that market, it's not their expertise. It's not a market they want to particularly invest in. Their market, their incentive is to export LNG. It's a different kind of business to go into the LNG bunkering market. That said, there are a couple of small companies that are talking to the big exporters and trying to identify opportunities of looking at some of the small volumes that haven't yet been sold on long-term contracts or on spot to be able to sell that on very short-term and localized area. So you have a couple of companies around the mouth of the Mississippi looking to provide LNG to some of the bunkering potential out there. But again, it's very nascent.
Professor Hangels, questions for you. From a geopolitical perspective, do you foresee any issues or do you have any comments concerning some of the regional cooperation that is going into developing LNG bunkering?
Are you talking about thinking about a particular?
And a particular example would be, for example, with the pipeline coming from Israel up to Greece and Italy.
I think more gas use in general carries less geopolitical risks than oil. So, gas supply is very plentiful everywhere now. We have at least 100 years worth of supply in the United States. We're discovering more gas around the world. More countries are getting into the LNG business. So I think in general, gas carries less geopolitical risks with it than oil. In terms of on a regional basis, again, I think that's more of an issue of, again, the geopolitical risks are not generally, I don't think, there. It's more of a question on the infrastructure being developed to take advantage of it. So there's a lot of potential in the Eastern Med. I'm a little surprised that Greece is a little behind on this. I would think that in their market, all these trips to the islands would make a lot of sense to have those ships running on natural gas. That would be a good market. So I don't see any particular geopolitical issues coming out of that.
Yeah, there's also a very interesting trend I want to mention. So when we do the presentation and prepare for it, we notice that if we want to further develop natural gas in the transportation sector, we have to rely on subsidy a lot. And so it's not only an issue in the natural gas transportation sector, but also, for example, in the EV sector. And so I'm wondering, like, if you have any opinion about, like, whether this is a good thing or bad thing. Like, government wants to, for example, offer more subsidies to the use of natural gas in the transportation sector.
For me?
Yeah.
I think subsidies, to an extent, are not necessarily a bad thing to help for a new industry to develop. But again, it has to be well framed and caged to allow then the market to sustain itself. As if it's unable to sustain itself, then it's never going to be profitable, and it's just going to be a drain on governments. So I think it seems to be working well in the Baltic. I think right now in Europe, they're still taking a big risk. They have put a lot of funding there to develop the LNG bunkering market and trucking market. And as you've pointed out in your study, the market is developing, but very slowly. And I think it's a question of, yes, it is going to happen, but we have to remember that, certainly in the marine sector, we went from sail to coal over 90 years. It doesn't happen overnight, and I think the same thing will happen with LNG. Is this a good thing with regards to electric vehicles? There is a big impetus with regards to climate change right now and environmental emissions. I think it is helpful for the governments to try and incentivize that and promote a market as long as the technology can then be developed to support that market and advance it. My question would be to you is, when you did your research and you compared LNG trucks and EV trucks, were they serving the same kind of markets in terms of, were the users of trucks were they same sort of long distance haulage, same kind of torque and kind of trucks, or were there different slate of markets?
Yeah, so there's a difference. So the LNG trucks are mainly responsible for long distance transportation, and EV is more like for short distance. This difference is more obvious in China's market. So in Shenzhen city, so the government doesn't allow like heavy duty trucks to enter downtown area during the peak hours. So electric trucks, their advantage is their size is pretty small. But if you want to add more natural gas in the truck, you have to have a big tank. So that's a huge issue. So yeah, I think there's a difference in the market size.
Let me add, this isn't one issue. You mentioned the Baltics, where geopolitics does come into play. Obviously, it's in the interest of some countries to provide subsidies to build some of the infrastructure so they can import and use LNG to reduce their reliance on other suppliers. But I'm wondering if maybe at least as important are regulations. So, what the IMO is doing, that's a regulatory change which is spurring the market. And I have a particular question about China. I was a little surprised that China's making great efforts to clean up the air in the cities, to try to move away from coal, and that includes using more natural gas. But I don't get the impression that they're thinking about shipping in the same way. And so, some of these port cities must have pretty dirty air. And if they were incentivizing gas use, that would certainly help. But from what you said here, the structure seems to be to disincentivize gas completely. So why is that a policy disconnect in some way?
Yeah, I would say that because although Chinese government is pushing really hard in paper to promote the use of natural gas in shipping sector, but there are not enough economic incentives nor subsidies for the application of natural gas in the sector. Also, because natural gas in shipping sector is still a very new thing in China, so there are not enough experience nor expertise in authorities to regulate this nascent field. So the government is now trying to solve this problem by introducing more experts in the sector, and also trying to think of another incentives, economic incentives for the application of natural gas in bunkering, because the previous ones already ended in 2015 and 2017, respectively, for new builds and retrofitting. So now they are thinking about new subsidies. So maybe in the future it will play out, but now there are still nothing.
Okay, if the audience has any questions, we're going to open it up for Q&A. Please walk around with the microphone.
Hi, thank you. Great panel. My name is John Canese. I'm an energy policy consultant. Actually, I have multiple questions, but I'll be judicious. I have two. One is, certainly, we were just talking about China and kind of impediments. Is there any sense that they are looking at streamlining the processes? I always thought the EU was one of the more complicated regions that go through the chart up there of China. And then the second question really is, if you don't mind, is U.S. versus Italy on the trucking side. Comment that no LNG vehicles offered here in the U.S., but considerable in terms of LNG trucks in Italy, lower capital costs, diesel, et cetera. Particular insight as to why that exists?
Okay, so there are the process of permitting in China is very complicated, mainly because LNG and natural gas in general, the use of this new fuel in bunkering sector is a very recent development. So the government itself doesn't have the experience, and it takes LNG as a very dangerous fuel, such as explosive dangers. So they make very many unnecessary strict standards for the LNG stations or CNG stations to pass through each year. So in the fact sheet, I didn't explain in details. In the fact sheet, there are some statistics about natural gas bunkering station already completed, but there are only 3 in operation because of these the process issues. The government is now trying to simplify the process and also introduce more experts to the authorities to make more sense of natural gas, the use of it in the bunkering sector. And in terms of the US trucking, I get the data from the DOE. It said that last year there is 0 LNG truck made available in the States. Yeah, I also interviewed with Shell commercial manager, one of them, and they said that the LNG doesn't make economic sense in terms of trucking, and it is more economic to use CNG or diesel. And now the diesel trucks have more energy efficiency, so they are cleaner than before. And LNG is different from CNG, which you can directly extract from the pipe. You need to condense it into liquid and also store it in very specific made tanks, and that drives the cost up a lot. So they didn't consider using LNG in trucking sector in the States.
Hi, my name is Benjamin Diwali, and I'm a concerned citizen. My question is about the adoption of natural gas in the railroad sector in the United States. And so I noticed from your guys' presentation that there's quite a spread between the price of diesel and the price of natural gas, at least historically. Now, given there's such a spread and that transportation sectors in general tend to be very low margin businesses, isn't there a strong incentive for the adoption by BNSF, Canadian Pacific, and Union Pacific to adopt these and install these type of LNG or CNG terminals where their rail yards are? It seems to me that there's quite a business case to be made for that. And I was wondering if the panel could add some more light to current I guess, developments in the sector in terms of adoption of natural gas for railroads? Thank you.
Me? Okay, so in railroads, it also involve with different participants. So the Florida East Coast Railway, they need to buy the engine from GE, and just both from regulator and the other private sectors, there are a lot of process, and in economic terms, is as long as natural gas is cheap, they have incentive to do this. But as I said in the recommendation findings part, we still consider there should be the policy support that just set the emission standards, because in the US, railway sector is quite, I would say, not that developed as other countries. So if there's no government regulation, the private sector will just think they still use the diesel, and it's cheaper, and it's also convenient for them because they have been using this for like 200 years. So I think that's the reason why that the incentive is not still not strong enough, even though the natural gas price is relatively cheap. Yeah.
Hi, I have a question concerning the methodology that you used. When you try to distinguish the different levels of risk between different countries, is there any specific standards that you use? Because I noticed apart from low, medium, high, there is also a middle ground, like medium, low. How do you distinguish these boundaries?
It was challenging, and I think one of the best ways we used to distinguish the boundaries was to compare the cases to one another too, relative to each other. But there is a level of subjectivity in terms of assigning the overall risk level, but the best way we could do to make it an equal assessment is to compare the cases against one another in evaluating the risk level. Yeah.
I can add it. So in terms of the risk, we at first in the beginning the risk is based on the specific countries, but after we done all the case studies, we want to combine with each other so that we make all the case studies make more sense and can give us understanding that if you are a country leader or you are an investor and you want to tap into different markets, so that you can apply to the markets you want to invest.
You looked at economic risks and also regulatory risks. Did you look at public opinion risks, public opposition, not in the different areas that you, not just in the different areas, but also in the different geographical areas that you looked at?
Well, we don't think that in the cases that we study, the public opinion risks are minimum, I would say, because for one example is the Jacksport. And when we visited there, it said that the public hearing of constructing a new LNG fuel terminal in the place is just, it lasted just 20 minutes. So it is, yeah, it was pretty short, and the public opinion there was pretty supportive. And yeah, that's surprising for us because we know the public hearing will last for days or weeks or months, but there is, it was just 20 minutes. Maybe public opinion will be an issue in China because people will think that LNG is explosive and it's not safe. But I covered it in the regulatory side. The regulatory authorities themselves think that LNG is dangerous. So this might be a case in China. Yeah.
From what I gathered in Europe, generally the public seemed to look favorably on it, just because, for instance, if you look at the bunkering sector, the shift to natural gas is creating a better air quality through lower sulfur emissions and also lower particulate matter emissions. And so the public was generally supportive of it.
I can add on the railway in states because the public image is important because that's also the FRA considers because for ECR and other commercial passenger rails in states, the accident rate is quite high compared to other countries. So if now we want to have natural gas, how do you prevent the tender with the natural gas if derailment happens? That's FIA really cares about because like normal accident derailment in United States already cause a lot of public image in the States. Yeah.
Can I ask another question? So you looked at risk levels, and I think that's fine, it's valid. I'm wondering, though, there wasn't so much discussion about opportunities. So, I think about bunkering in Northwest Europe, okay, people like that, but, how much can that grow? I think about China, energy demand growing in all sectors, and so there's a risk level that may encourage you to go one place rather than another, but then there's the, thinking about the opportunities where you may be willing to put up with some of the bureaucracy or whatever because the opportunities are so great. So I'm wondering if any of you could comment about what opportunities you see for where growth could really occur for using LNG in these different sectors that you looked at.
Yeah, so for the trucking sector, I think opportunity is actually a relative term because if we want to develop more natural gas trucks, we have to, because they account for a certain market share and their competitors are like diesel trucks and electric trucks. So if developing natural gas trucks has lower risk, it means that they can, compared to diesel and electric trucks, they have higher opportunity. So in terms of trucking sector, the main driving force, like the main advantage of natural gas trucks compared to diesel trucks is that the government is really willing to phase out diesel trucks. So actually they create an opportunity for them. But at the same time, we have to notice that the market is, what they care about is which is cheaper and which is cleaner. And so obviously, electric vehicles, they're like zero emissions. They're definitely much cleaner than natural gas trucks. And what they consider is in the long term, like which vehicles they choose can pay back faster. So it's still not certain like whether it's more, natural gas trucks are more competitive or the electric trucks. So I would say they have opportunity, but it's still not for sure.
Comments about shipping or?
I mean shipping in China?
Well, just
Yeah.
again, this, the risk level might be lower somewhere, but maybe not so much opportunity. Risk level higher elsewhere, but more opportunity.
Yeah, one major problem in China's bunkering sector is that the diesel was subsidized in China.
Right.
Yeah, so it is pretty low compared with LNG because China needs to import LNG and the price is much higher even compared with Europe. So the economic case is very different, very difficult to make. But now China has various regulations in pipeline to for higher emission standards, and also China is considering to establish a few emission control areas, such as Shanghai, Beijing, and Guangzhou. So there are opportunities, but it is so difficult to make economic sense because the diesel is still subsidized and LNG is imported. Yeah.
Just building off that question that you just answered now, I noticed your presentation addressed inland waterway transportation and the use of bunkering in LNG. But what about for like external trade and sort of international shipping routes? Is LNG used more in China in that domain, or is it still about comparable with inland waterways? Thank you.
Well, China now, previously, Chinese government pushed more in the inland waterway sector because China was not part of the LMO, and the emission control areas will only be established in the future. So the international ships that use LNG are mostly from China to other places such as Europe or America, where the emission standards are pretty strict. So our main focus is in inland waterway sector.
Anything else?
I think that's all we have. Thank you so much. I hope you learned something. Thank you so much.
Thank you.